What's up, everybody? My name is Dimitri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and to learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this week's episode is Lauren Aguirre, an award-winning science journalist whose book, The Mind Thief, tells the story of a team of doctors who, through years of investigation, discover a surprising connection between the use of opioids, specifically fentanyl, and memory loss. This condition, first discovered in overdose victims with severe damage to their hippocampus, has since led to a series of discoveries about the nature of memory, as well as the mysteries that persist about how we remember, where memories live, how they're formed, and why we forget most of what happens to us in a day, but can remember some events with stunning clarity, years, even decades later. Perhaps the greatest mystery that Lauren tackles in her book, however, is why Alzheimer's, a degenerative brain disease responsible for causing dementia and early death, has continued to evade scientific capture despite afflicting tens of millions of people around the world. It's one of the questions we explored during the episode Overtime, where Lauren also shares information about some of the more promising new strategies and developments that may finally lead to an effective treatment and perhaps even cure of this devastating disease. So without any further ado, please enjoy this week's highly informative and eye-opening conversation with my guest, journalist and author, Lauren Aguirre. Lauren Aguirre, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Hi, Dimitri. I'm happy to be here.
It's great having you on, Lauren. So I'm very excited to talk about your book. The title of the book is The Memory Thief and the Secrets Behind How We Remember. What would you say the book is about, and what is it about memory specifically that intrigues you so much?
Okay, so I'll start with the subject of memory and why it intrigues me. Of course, it intrigues everyone, and as you go around and tell people, hey, I'm writing a book about memory, they say, oh, my memory's terrible. But in this case, I was particularly interested in memory because, like you, I have a brain abnormality that I was completely unaware of until I started having these bizarre kind of déjà vu moments more and more frequently, where it seemed like I had done exactly that thing before, but obviously I hadn't. So that's a trick of memory. But then early one morning, it was much worse. And what happened was, it's called jamais vu. So this feeling of dread crept over me. And at the same time, my memories just completely slipped away. So I no longer knew where I was, where in time or even history I was. And most of all, I didn't know who I was. So if you had walked into the room at that moment and said, hey, I'm Dimitri, who are you? I could not have told you. So that was so terrifying that I lay face down on the floor and closed my eyes and just hoped it would pass. And fortunately, it did after a few minutes. So I picked myself up, took myself to the doctor, and she said, that sounds like a seizure. You might have a brain tumor. So lots and lots of tests and EEGs and MRIs and consultations. One neurosurgeon said, well, that could be cancerous. We should take it out. But I got a lot of second opinions because, as you can imagine, that wasn't high on my list, was to open up my brain right from the get-go. So one of the people I asked for his opinion on it was someone I knew, a neurologist named Jed Barish. And he came over to my house and looked at my brain scan. And I have a pretty gnarly looking right frontal lobe, but he looked through it and he said, you know what? You're going to be fine. You should just take your medicine, and I think everything's going to be okay. So that was the course I took, and he was absolutely right. And the only thing it really left me with was, a fascination for weird brains and a very deep respect for how frightening it is to lose your memory.
How did that experience help you in writing this book and in the research that you did beyond simply just giving you an interest in the subject? Did it help that you knew intuitively how bizarre an experience it can be to lose your memory?
I think it probably helped. Of course, I can't run the control experiment, but I was possibly much more sensitive to what it feels like to lose your memory in terms of talking to people to whom this happened or to their family members. And the other connection was that Jed Barish, the neurologist who looked at my scan, 3 years later, saw the first patient who had this strange new brain injury. And what this injury is sort of like a chemically induced brain injury where people who overdose on fentanyl, and only a tiny fraction of people who overdose on fentanyl, which is in and of itself mysterious, for them, fentanyl hones in on the hippocampus and causes severe, severe damage, such that when they come to from the overdose, they have what you had. They had anterograde amnesia, and they can't remember anything for more than 30 seconds. So if they're in the hospital, they'll wake up, they'll say, "Why am I here?" And the mother will say, "You overdosed," and they'll be sad and upset about it. And then they'll forget. And 30 seconds later, they'll ask the same question.
So if I remember correctly, Jed Barish was not the first physician in your book to encounter this issue, documented at least. What is the first documented case that we have of patients presenting in hospitals with this type of brain injury?
That actually was the first case, but I think what you're referring to is I opened the book with kind of a flash forward in 2018 of a patient who had this happen to him and, woke up and none of his doctors knew what it was, even though these patients had been identified starting with that first one in 2012.
Right, the patient who had been a heroin user, I think 15 or 20 years ago. Is that the patient you're describing?
The patient had been, I call him Owen Rivers in the book just to protect his privacy. He had actually become addicted to drugs starting at the age of 11 when he found some Vicodin in his neighbor's medicine cabinet, sort of classic story that you hear about. And he progressed to more and more drugs and higher, more potent opioids to ultimately to fentanyl. And all the while, he is a very, very unusual story because all the while he grew increasingly concerned about his memory loss to the point of spending hours every day writing down lists of things to do, things he mustn't forget, and also journaling just about his thoughts about the day. And this became really a debilitating obsession for him. He was also very, very intelligent. So despite this really frequent drug use, he went to a prestigious university. He studied the neurobiology of memory. He studied how drugs affect memory. But then finally, he succeeded in being sober for about 18 months. This was several years after he graduated. But it was, always hard, and the cravings were always there. And then he experienced a seizure, basically an aura. He started smelling things that no one else could smell. So he took himself to the doctor, and the doctor said, "I think you might have a tumor. Let's get an MRI." So he was waiting for the results. There was a first MRI that was suggestive, so he had to go for a second. And he was ecstatic. I mean, I was terrified, but he was ecstatic because this was his ticket to go back to using fentanyl. If there wasn't any fear of letting people down, and that was what was keeping him sober, if he was going to die of cancer, he could go back to it. So he was happy for about 2 weeks. And then one night he got an email from his doctor saying, "Great news. There's no tumor. You're actually fine." And that was such devastating news that he went on Craigslist, found some fentanyl, drove out to get it, came back, used it, and when he woke up, he had this same anterograde amnesia.
I mean, obviously that's disturbing on so many levels. One, emotionally, to have that sort of reaction to what is ostensibly good news, but also to wake up with this kind of brain injury. Can you describe for our listeners what we're talking about here? What it is that actually occurs both biologically and then also phenomenologically to individuals that experience this?
So phenomenologically, like I said, he wakes up in the hospital, but he, having studied memory, it's much more salient to him. And the doctor knows this. So the doctor says, "You overdosed and you damaged your hippocampus." And he says, "What, my hippocampus?" And, immediately starts crying because he knows what that means. But then he gets distracted. His doctor wore the same shoes that he wore, and he noticed that. And he said, "Oh, hey, doc, you're wearing Doc Martens." And the doctor's like, yep, I'm wearing Doc Martens. And then he walks around the foot of the bed and comes back into view. And Owen says, hey, Doc, you're wearing Doc Martens. So, that's sort of funny. And actually, his family, they sort of laughed about it. But ultimately, it's just such a disassociation from your life. And for him, it becomes hard to maintain relationships because their lives have moved on. So he still remembers everything that happened to him before, but he can't lay down any new memories because that's what the hippocampus does, is it allows you to form new memories. So his best friend might have broken up with his girlfriend and told him that the night before, and he'll go out and have lunch with him and not know and sort of step in it. So he's sort of stuck in this permanent present and can't kind of piece things together. Now, it's interesting because he still remembers emotions, but he can't attach them to a specific episode or a specific event. And time is really difficult for him. Like on his birthday, he didn't remember how old he was. He had to do the math to figure it out.
Yeah, that's to that point, to sort of flesh out for listeners, what you're saying in terms of emotionally is, for example, if someone attacks him on the street, if he were to meet that person again, he may very well feel the emotions associated with that experience and have negative feelings towards that individual, but not understand why or recall the event.
That's exactly right. Yeah. He might have some vague sense of it, but he won't be able to put it together in a scene. And this is one of the ideas about what the hippocampus does, is it's a scene constructor. So it pulls together the sights, the sounds, the smells, the emotions, the order of things, and creates an episode.
So there are two ways we can take this conversation. One is that we can take this opportunity to explore a bit more for listeners how it is that we understand that memory works, the role of the hippocampus, where memories are stored, how they're tagged, how they're used and stitched together in a timeline to create a narrative about and a story about the past, and how the role that all of this plays in our capacity for imagination, which is so powerful and oftentimes underlooked, and something that you do discuss in the book. Otherwise, we could continue the conversation around the main story of the book, which is actually trying to figure out who or what the memory thief is, what's causing all of these injuries. So I leave that up to you.
Okay. Well, I think we should continue with the memory thief, because if I go into memory, you'll forget where I started, not you, but my listeners. So it won't make as much sense. And I really did try from a narrative perspective, because the field of memory is so vast, to somewhat limit myself to the concepts that would make sense in light of this story. So, throughout the book, I go back and forth between this investigation and what we know about how memory works and how we know it, and what we know about Alzheimer's disease. So to go back to the investigation, it was 2012 when Jed Barish and other doctors saw this first patient, and they just didn't know what to make of it. They had never seen a brain scan that looked like that, where just the hippocampus showed up as being damaged. And what happens is when neurons die, the blood flow changes and it can't move through that tissue as well. And so this particular type of MRI picks that up, that the water is not moving as it should. And then that bit of brain tissue will glow. It'll show up bright and the rest of the brain will be like a dark gray. So as Barish described it, it was almost like someone took a page out of his neuroanatomy textbook and outlined just the hippocampus, which is very unusual for just one part of a brain to be damaged. So that was 2012, and the doctors at Lahey in Burlington, where they saw this patient, didn't know what to make of it. And lots of neurologists will see such flukes and kind of file them away in the back of their minds because they don't know what to make of it. And then a few years later, a construction worker from New Hampshire came in with his wife and mother for answers. He had 2 months earlier experienced the same sudden amnesia. His family had gone away for the weekend, and he was fine when they left. And when they came back, he was, just like Owen and just like Max, the 2012 patient. So Barish wasn't, he hadn't yet connected the dots with Max, but he found out that the patient did have a history of heroin use. And when he put the scan in and looked at it, it was exactly the same pattern as Max. So then at that point, you say, okay, it's opioids are the connection, but people have been misusing heroin for many decades. And I'm not seeing cases like this when I go into the literature. So what has changed? And he has epidemiological training, so he thinks about it in that kind of big picture population way. Well, what had changed, especially in Massachusetts, is that starting in 2012, fentanyl was making its way into the drug supply. And so people were often taking fentanyl without knowing it. That's still true today, and it's part of what's driving the opioid overdose deaths. So if there were two people isn't a lot, but for him, he thought there's something important here. So he reached out to the CDC and said, we have no way of knowing how many other people there are like this out there. What about putting out a nationwide call for more cases? And they came back and said, it's just two. It could be a coincidence. It could be amnestic shellfish poisoning. There's really not enough to go on here. So then he went to the Department of Public Health in Massachusetts, where the state epidemiologist, Al DiMaria, said, wow, that's really interesting. If you find a few more cases, I'll put out a health alert in Massachusetts. So maybe 9 or so months later, they did come across 2 more patients at Leahy, which makes you think it's got to be a fair bit more common because that's just one hospital in Massachusetts. So at that point, they did put out a call to all Massachusetts doctors, and within minutes started getting emails back. Oh, I've seen such a patient, 49-year-old male, history of heroin use, complete anterograde amnesia. So they got about 25 reports. Not all of them met the criteria that they laid out, but an additional 10. So that got them an additional 10. So this was a cluster of 14 patients associated with opioid use with this imaging.
All at Leahy?
No. So the first 4 were at Leahy, and then the 10 others were mostly from the Boston area. So this time the CDC took note, and a report was published in the MMWR, Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. And that's when the media picked up on it, and that's when I said, this sounds really interesting, and is there more to it? And it turned out there's a lot more to it. So first of all, how do you find out if your hunch that it's fentanyl is correct? Because ironically enough, none of those 14 tested positive for fentanyl, but that's because they weren't tested for fentanyl, which seems surprising, but it's expensive to test for fentanyl. You have to send it out to another hospital, and many people are taking multiple drugs. They might be taking heroin mixed with fentanyl. So if you do a drug screen for an overdose patient in the hospital and you get opiates and amphetamines, you're done. You understand why they overdosed, but you don't know if they took fentanyl.
And you also don't know, in addition, whether it was one of the other drugs or whether it was some cocktail that led to that outcome.
Right. You don't know that. And you also don't know, is it a toxic contaminant and not fentanyl or some other drug? So what they really needed was someone who took fentanyl, for sure. Let's start there. And then someone who only took fentanyl. So that took a while to get to, but Barish stumbled across a neuropsychologist in West Virginia who had seen one of these patients but chalked it up to amphetamines because he wasn't tested for fentanyl. So Barish called him up and said, if you see this again, can you test for fentanyl? So a short time later, in fact, that did happen, and the person was positive for fentanyl. But he was also positive for a handful of other drugs. So another option was to look at the chief medical examiner in Massachusetts at their office, because they do test for fentanyl when someone dies of an overdose. But for complicated reasons, that just didn't seem like an appropriate research project. But then the third option was go back to the Massachusetts doctor community with another alert from the Department of Public Health and say, if you see another such patient, it would be great if you could test for fentanyl. So very quickly, they got 4 such cases. 3 of them had other drugs, but 1 used fentanyl alone. So that was, okay, we know for sure that fentanyl alone can cause this damage. But although there was still the lingering question of a toxic contaminant, because it's a street drug, who knows what was in it. But then shortly thereafter, a woman in Canada, 63-year-old woman in Canada who was prescribed fentanyl patches for severe pain, used 2 one night instead of 1. And she woke up with this exact same condition. So that pretty much rules out the idea of a contaminant.
So I have a question there, which is 2 patches. I mean, I don't know how much more fentanyl that is than the prescribed dose. It doesn't sound like that much. I mean, certainly when you compare it to Owen's case, for example, it sounded like in that case, he took way more fentanyl. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, how are they able to distinguish? And let's say in this case, they have one patient. She was an older patient, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
She didn't take anywhere near as much, if I'm not mistaken, as, let's say, some of these other overdose patients. And granted, we know for sure that there weren't any contaminants, or at the very least, if it was contaminated from a regulated laboratory. It's still just one patient. So where did the investigation lead from there? What conclusions could they draw, and what additional measures could they take in order to try and gain more confidence around this diagnosis?
Right. So to answer your point about the dose, that depends a lot on the person. I don't actually know. You're probably right that Owen took more than she did, but the dose is affected by the person. So if she also hadn't used her fentanyl patches in a while, she then was not sort of tolerant to it. She hadn't built up that tolerance. And if I remember correctly, that might have been the case. But in order to kind of dig deeper, obviously they need more patients, and they are very hard to find for a number of reasons, not least of which is kind of the stigma surrounding people who have substance use disorders who, we often just don't seem to care as much about. But they also, most of these patients had either passed away or disappeared. So you couldn't do follow-up and say, well, what exactly did the damage look like later on once that initial injury had kind of healed? What was the permanent damage? How did it affect the hippocampus in different ways? How much did it shrink it? And what does their long-term memory impairment look like? So that's where the story of Owen Rivers becomes so important in the investigation, because he had an MRI before he overdosed. They knew exactly what his hippocampus looked like then. They had the MRI from the overdose, and because he really wanted to make some sort of meaning out of his tragedy, and if not find answers for himself, at least sort of help the investigation, he agreed to go to the Memory and Aging Center at the University of California in San Francisco and participate in research. So there they did these really advanced kind of volumetric studies of his hippocampus and found that it had shrunk by about 10%. It doesn't sound like a lot, but that's as much as a 60-year-old would lose in a decade. And it also sort of shrunk not in a uniform way, which would lead you more to think that it's not something like hypoxia, which many doctors sort of initially, when I describe the syndrome, would say, oh, well, they're deprived of oxygen and that's what it is. But that tends to be a more diffuse injury. It wouldn't have that specificity to it. It almost certainly does contribute to the injury. So they learned that about the imaging. And then they also did really advanced neuropsychological testing and found that his episodic memory, so his memory for new events and new information, was on par of someone with advanced Alzheimer's. But the rest of his cognitive function was pretty much intact. I mean, he's very intelligent, as I said, and one day that I spent with him, we kind of drove around and we stopped at a coffee shop and he said, oh, let's play Scrabble. But he had never played the board game version of it. He had only ever played it on his phone. So he hadn't had to learn the rules. And so every turn he would say, how many letters in the tray? And I'd have to say 7. And yet he beat me. He has a much better vocabulary than I have. So that sort of shows you the specificity of this type of memory loss, that you have your prior knowledge. You just don't have the ability to make new memories.
So I have a question about this. One, how is he emotionally at this point in time? Has he accepted his condition? And is he more or less emotionally grounded in that? And the other question is, because this is something, again, that, I related with so many of the stories in the book, and Owen's in particular. I mean, I did those cognitive tests. They were scary, frustrating. I had an appointment at NYU with a cognitive psychologist there who ran me through a bunch of tests, and it was incredibly frustrating and scary to see just how awful my results were in real time. And I was, deeply emotionally disturbed during this time. But the thing that I wanted to ask you also is, in addition to how he felt, the thing that I never really understood for myself was I couldn't remember anything, but I could remember that I couldn't remember. So he's able to remember that. How are they able, has anyone been able to provide some answers as to how it is that Owen knows that he has a brain injury and yet can't remember anything after the brain injury, but he can remember that he has a brain injury?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm not sure I have an answer for that. Maybe that requires an injury that is bigger than the hippocampus. The neuropsychologist who found the West Virginia patient told me about a stroke patient that he had. And I think her damage was definitely to the hippocampus, but might have been broader. And for her, it was very, very difficult for him to teach her, why are you here? And that took massive repetition. But once she understood that she had a memory problem, then she was kind of available for, okay, I understand that I need some strategies to have some kind of independence. And so he harnessed a different memory system that does not involve the hippocampus, which is procedural memory, which is things like riding a bike. And through that, he was able to teach her sort of how to move through her house, how to move through the day and take her pills and make her coffee. So yeah, that's a really interesting question as to how he knew, but he definitely knew that he couldn't remember. So as to, how he feels now, I asked 5 people who were prominent in the book to write an essay for the end of it, just to give their perspective on what did this mean to them. And he wrote the most beautiful essay. I've reread it so many times because, he describes what it's like and the frustration, but also the irony of he feels he has become sort of like the patient that he used to study, HM, the patient who had his hippocampus removed to treat epilepsy. And that's how they learned, oh, you need your hippocampus to make new memories. So he had studied this patient over and over again to the point where it was sort of annoying. And then he was like, wow, I'm like HM. And that's what he felt like when he got the news of how bad his memory was. But he's also, he says, I wish there had been some sort of more kinder, more gentler way to impart this lesson of having gratitude for what you do have. And so he is just very grateful for his friends and his family and his support and everything that he learned before that he can still use. And strangely enough, the, obsession of list writing and journaling that was so bothersome to him before are now the strategies that he needs to survive. Like if he had not honed those skills, he would be in much worse shape right now. So he has a job, he takes classes at a community college, and he has a life, and it's very different from what he thought it would be, but he's mostly grateful.
So you said he takes classes at community college. How does he retain that information? What are the systems that he's developed to be able to actually learn, considering that his short-term memory has been so badly impaired?
Note-taking. So if he doesn't remember, he goes back and looks at his notes. And remember, his hippocampus isn't removed, so it's not like a complete inability to remember things. And it's also some things are harder than others. So like spatial information is completely gone.
Does that also mean that in abstract terms, he can't distinguish positioning? For example, does he know that Boston is north of New York?
Right. I remember you saying that was a problem for you. I never asked him that, but he did. One of his jobs involved working at a senior center and going around on a little cart and collecting quarters from the laundromat. And there was no map, and it was a different route every day. But because of the tools that we have and Google Maps, and because he's really intelligent, he figured out a system to make that work. So in a way, it doesn't really matter to him whether, Boston is north of New York or not. But he did feel like people at the senior center wondered why he was constantly taking notes. But that's what he needed to do to remember the rules, to remember who was who.
Yeah. So I did ask you about, and I am curious how he copes with this emotionally. You said he feels gratitude, but is there a heightened, would he say that he's more anxious, or would he be described as being more anxious now post-injury than he was prior?
I don't think so, because part of what really fed into his substance use disorder was obsessive compulsive disorder. So what he refers to as memory hoarding, his list writing and journaling was the manifestation of his OCD, which had been very resistant to treatment. And he also suffered from depression and anxiety. So mental illness is definitely a risk factor for substance use disorders. So after the overdose, he finally got into a program at UCLA, which really helped his symptoms. You know, it's not gone, but it's not kind of an obsession that feels overwhelming. So it seems to me that emotionally, he's in a better place.
So where are these researchers currently with this? And what sort of help are they getting from the CDC and national institutions to try and garner a larger data set, a larger cohort of individuals so they can feel more confident about the source of this memory thief, as you call it?
Right. So, you know, we have a lot of problems in this country to work on, health problems. And this really seems sort of like paying a lot of attention to it would be worrying about the arrangement of the deck chairs while the Titanic is going down. So at this point, it's still Barish and a handful of other neurologists and anesthesiologists and radiologists kind of working on their own time, saying, how can we investigate this further? How can we move this forward? So they have been in touch with the FDA. The FDA has this kind of listening system where people can go in and post reports about potential adverse reactions, but they're not going to do it about street drugs. That would only happen with pharmaceutical fentanyl. So that's not the best route. There is a surveillance system in Massachusetts that they're trying to look at to just get a sense of prevalence. And they are, you know, one of the ideas to come out of this investigation is, as I said, the dose makes the poison. So we know that fentanyl, which is an incredibly powerful opioid, does this severe damage to the hippocampus. And if we have time, I can talk about why. But what about lower dose opioids? Are they causing subtle memory impairments that are going under the radar in people who are taking their medicine as prescribed, their opioids, but high dose opioids for long periods for chronic pain? So I'm not talking about someone who, you know, has surgery and takes Vicodin for a few days. This is really ongoing use because there's a lot of anecdotal information and patients complaining like, my memory just isn't working right. So these researchers at UPenn are going to investigate this.
Well, yeah, that was going to be my next question, which is that fentanyl is used, people might be familiar with this, it's used in anesthesia. So The question is, why has that not shown up there? And what does that tell us about how fentanyl could theoretically be impacting people who show up with this like massive injury to their hippocampus? And then, yes, how does this relate to chronic opioid use, not just fentanyl?
Right. So the theory about how this damage is caused is based on, so there's two classes of neurons in the brain, and the ones we think about are called excitatory neurons, and they're kind of dumb because they just take in information, and when they get enough, they pass it on to the next neuron. And those make up about 80% of your neurons, but the other 20% are called inhibitory neurons, and they're the real brains of the system because they control the timing and the flow of information. You can't just have signals passing on without any kind of breaks in the system. So they're kind of like the bouncers at the bar, and if you take them out of the picture, you have chaos. So fentanyl, being a really powerful opioid, it binds onto these mu opioid receptors, which in inhibitory neurons shuts them down. So they can no longer do their job. And also in the context of not having enough oxygen, the hippocampus just can't keep up with the metabolic demands and cells start to die. So, and this is known that fentanyl does this, that it interacts with the mu opioid receptors in this way. So that's not really a question. Then you have to ask, well, is it purely the lack of oxygen? So an anesthesiologist, actually the same one who's going to do the lower dose opioids question, he did a whole series of experiments with rodents looking at what fentanyl does to the hippocampus, and he kept them intubated, so it wasn't a lack of oxygen. And they had this same damage to the hippocampus. So then you have the animal evidence really backing up what is seen in these amnestic patients. So, that's enough of a basis to say, well, is this really relevant to humans? And are opioids at lower doses and less potent opioids, are they not like removing the bartenders from the bar, but just, giving them some drinks so that they're not doing their job as well, and then interfering in the function of the hippocampus?
So do we know anything about how opioids interfere with inhibitory neurons?
Yes. So they do the opposite of what normally you would think, oh, you put a drug in and it turns on a neuron. Well, it doesn't. It turns these guys off.
So not just fentanyl.
Not just fentanyl. All
right.
Opioids have this effect, but most opioids are a lot less powerful. So they're not going to shut the whole system down and lead to widespread cell death, but they are going to impair kind of the information processing. The hippocampus is extremely finely tuned. It has an incredibly difficult job to do of pulling together all this information at once. And so that's a tough information processing job. And if you don't have your gatekeepers and your neurons that are saying, turn off, turn on, don't go, the memory encoding just doesn't work as well.
So, Lauren, I'm going to move the second part of our conversation into the overtime. In your book, you mention Alzheimer's, which represents, I believe, roughly 2/3 of all dementia cases in the United States. So it's a devastating illness. And of course, everyone, as they get older, they lose memory function over time. So this is something obviously that concerns everyone in one way or another. And I absolutely want to talk about that because I think it's interesting what you've written about and also how this study and this science and this story relates to that.
Yep.
I would also like to discuss strategies and tools and developments as they relate to memory and what we've learned about how we can actually strengthen memory, not just if we have memory problems pre-existing, but also as we get older. Because what I've learned over the years is that we absolutely, bearing, extreme cases of lobotomies or cases where people have massive injuries to the brain, we can absolutely impact our memory, and our memories can get better, and they can also degrade. And something you don't talk about in the book, but I'd be curious to ask you as well in the overtime, is if you've seen any studies that look at how technology, particularly the types of technologies that allow us to offload all sorts of daily tasks to computers, whether it is GPS, whether it is memory-related tasks, degrade our memory and degrade certain aspects of how our brains work. So that's what I want to talk about. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener-supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second part of today's conversation with Lauren, as well as the transcripts and rundowns to this episode and every other episode we've ever done, head over to hiddenforces.io and check out our episode library or subscribe directly through our Patreon page at patreon.com/hiddenforces. There's also a link in the summary page to this episode with instructions on how to connect the overtime feed to your phone so that you can listen to these extra discussions just like you listen to the regular podcast. Lauren, stick around. We're going to move the second part of our conversation into the subscriber overtime.
Okay.
Today's episode of Hidden Forces was recorded in New York City. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page at patreon.com/hiddenforces. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.